And welcome to Hannity and Tonight. So January 6th is now dominating the news cycle all over the country. MSDNC, fake news CNN, in Washington, Democrats, Capitol Hill, and others seething with rage. But per usual, they're not telling the full story. In fact, they are omitting a very critical element of that fateful day. How did rioters breach one of the most important buildings in the most fortified city in America on a day when the vice president and almost every lawmaker was inside, and when everyone knew there was going to be a big rally expected at the Capitol that day? Now, coming up tonight, the person who was serving as the Capitol Police Chief on January 6th, Stephen's son, he will join us and help answer that question. And it's an extremely important question. As I said at the time, the January 6th committee, they had a predetermined outcome to go after Donald Trump, bludgeon him as much as possible. And that's why Congressman Jim Jordan, Congressman Jim Banks were off the committee. They were kicked off the committee, and only members that impeached Donald Trump were allowed on the committee. Not exactly a fair committee. Now, sadly, Democrats are not interested in learning how the Capitol was breached, why security failed so badly. But here's the saddest part to me, and it should be to the whole country, and that is this whole saga. It is the buried key and important information that we now know about intelligence that they had that was being ignored in the lead up to January 6th. And they should have come up with a comprehensive security plan to ensure this could never, ever happen again, like securing a perimeter, kind of like at the White House. You know, they have those concrete barriers that prevent you from getting on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Then they have the big wrought iron fencing. We should all agree on this point. This is not a political point. Protecting our institutions like our Capitol and every elected official, regardless of party, it needs to be a top priority. But for Democrats and others, politicizing something, in this case smearing Donald Trump, was the only thing that seemed to matter to that committee. But you don't have to take good old Sean Hannity's word for it. To their credit, even NBC News pointed out all of this during a report this year. A little late, but they pointed it out. Good for them.
Now to our NBC News exclusive. The January 6th committee's final report was more than 800 pages, but some material did not make the cut, including much of its findings on the failures of federal law enforcement leading up to the attack.
The chief investigator of the January 6th committee says the government could have prevented it.
Had law enforcement agencies acted on the available intelligence, do you believe the attack on the Capitol could have been successfully repelled?
I think it would have been a lot different had law enforcement taken a more assertive, protective posture. The intel in advance was pretty specific, and it was enough, in our view, for law enforcement to have done a better job operationalizing a secure perimeter. Law enforcement had a very direct role in contributing to really the failures, the security failures that led to the violence.
People familiar with the committee's work tell NBC News members downplayed that finding because they wanted to keep the focus on former President Trump. Committee members dispute that. Hannity would not discuss internal deliberations.
Was this an intelligence failure?
It was not an intelligence failure.
We just had protesters, C-circle, breach the line. We need backup.
Hannity says the committee found the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies did not act on the intelligence they had, including this online threat forwarded to Capitol Police January 5th, calling on thousands to go to Washington and help storm the Capitol. In a statement to NBC News, the FBI said it sent all the intelligence it had to the Capitol Police.
So the partisan Trump-hating January 6th committee, with a predetermined outcome, sadly buried the security breakdowns from its reports, even though the committee's own chief investigator found, quote, a lot of advanced intelligence about law enforcement, about carrying weapons, about the vulnerability of the Capitol. And, quote, the intel in advance was pretty specific, and it was enough, in our view, for law enforcement to have done a better job. Now, think about this. Security officials, Washington, D.C., they knew a massive crowd is going to be gathering for a rally only blocks away from the Capitol on January 6th. In the days, the weeks leading up to January 6th, the FBI, other federal security agencies, they were tracking what they describe as a large volume of intelligence showing violent agitators plotting, planning, scheming an attack on our Capitol, the U.S. Capitol. And yet a few hundred Capitol Police were left to fend for themselves on a massive Capitol complex spanning multiple huge buildings with dozens of entrances on one of the most important days of the year. So the question is, how on earth did this happen? And why was this not the main focus of this failed committee? They could have gone after Trump, and they could have done this part of the job that mattered too, frankly, which was more important, to prevent it from ever happening again. The Capitol Police Chief at the time, Stephen Sund, was begging for help before the riot. But according to Sund, his requests for the National Guard were rejected or delayed 6 separate times. Watch this from Just the News.
When I asked Paul Irving for the National Guard, he used the term optics. And what's interesting is I'm on the phone with the Pentagon at 9:34, begging for the National Guard to deploy to assist my men and women. And Lieutenant General Piot is using the term concern for the optics. I'll never forget it. Quote, I'm concerned of the optics of the military standing in line with the Capitol in the background. So here they are both using the exact same term. When you see the level of intelligence now that was out there, you're just dumbfounded by it. That didn't occur. Those were lessons we should have learned from September 11th that we still haven't learned by January 6th. Intelligence was treated completely different on January 6th than it usually is for major events in Washington, D.C.
Optics? Could there possibly be a worse optic than what we saw on January 6th? And on such an important day, why take the risk? Protecting members of Congress, the vice president and president of our Capitol should take priority, should they not? Not optics. But instead of digging into the security failures, Democrats, they conducted multiple investigations and, of course, their impeachment and a January 6th committee that focused almost solely on Donald Trump. And now there is no plan to prevent this from ever happening again. And because of their anti-Trump rage, they're not even able to conduct a serious investigation into a riot that they have been obsessing about for more than 2 years, and no safety measures have been put in place. Pretty hypocritical, and it's also dangerous, especially from a group of people who never really seemed to care about the riots. This was political bludgeoning for them, and about real safety and security on January 6th. Now, we all remember, for example, in the summer of 2020, 574 violent riots that summer. Democrats all but they either told you nothing, or they ignored them, or they lied to you and told you they were mostly peaceful. What happened? We had dozens of dead Americans. We had thousands of injured cops. They were hit with rocks and bottles and Molotov cocktails and worse. We saw looting and arson on a massive scale, billions and billions of dollars worth of property damage, 0 investigations from Democrats in Congress, no investigations into high-ranking politicians like Kamala Harris that were out there supporting bail funds for the people involved in these, quote, activities, the rioting. Others were pouring fuel on the fire by vilifying cops and pushing the defund, dismantle, no bail laws of police departments. They did nothing as a federal courthouse in Portland was lit on fire over and over and over and over again. There wasn't one single solitary committee meeting or committee put together to look into those 574 riots. They ignored the riot at the White House, where Secret Service officers were attacked, you may recall, and the president was forced to evacuate that night to a bunker. Most Americans deplore all violent riots. We condemned every one of them. We condemned January 6th in real time on my radio show and right here that night on this show. Most Americans want our elected officials, regardless of what their party affiliation is, to be safe and protected. This needs to transcend politics. You would think this is something Democrats, Republicans should be, protecting together. And by the way, that would also include Supreme Court justices. They should be protected. There are laws against people protesting in front of their homes, but we're not enforcing those laws. For many Democratic politicians, a violent riot is a political opportunity. Why? I guess they think they can rally their base, or certainly they don't want to alienate their base. And maybe that's why they weren't and aren't focused on very real security failures at the Capitol on January 6th, or maybe it's because a prominent Democrat is to blame for those security failures. According to the former Capitol Police Chief, Stephen Sund, who will join us in a minute, the House Sergeant at Arms turned down his National Guard requests prior to January 6th because, quote, I will never get this by Pelosi.